not my investment. I typed those 3 words, set my phone face down on my desk, and went back to the quarterly report I'd been working on for 6 hours straight. My hands were steady. That surprised me. 20 minutes later, my brother called. I let it go to voicemail. Let me back up. I'm 31 years old. I work as a financial analyst at a mid-sized consulting firm in Denver, which means I spend my days telling other people how to manage their money responsibly. There's something almost funny about that now. In hindsight, I've spent years building a career around fiscal discipline, around the idea that numbers don't lie, and emotions shouldn't drive financial decisions. And for most of my life, I managed to keep those 2 worlds separate. My professional life, clean and logical, and my family life, which was anything but. My brother is 28. His name is Felix, and for as long as I can remember, he has been the kind of person who moves through the world with a particular confidence that I used to mistake for ambition. He's charming in the way that certain people are charming. The kind that makes you feel special when he talks to you, makes you feel chosen. Until you realize the charm is less about you and more about what he needs in the moment. Growing up, Felix was always the idea guy, always had a plan, always had a vision, always had a reason why this time was different, why this particular idea was the one that was going to work. Our parents loved that about him. They called it entrepreneurial spirit. I called it something else, but I kept that mostly to myself. I've been supporting Felix in small ways since I was 24. It started with a $400 car repair when he was between jobs. I told myself it was a one-time thing. Then it was $800 for a certification course he said would help him get into project management. Then, $100 to cover 2 months of his phone bill and part of his rent when his roommate bailed on him. I never kept a running tally. I told myself that's what family does. I told myself he was just finding his footing. He never paid any of it back. Not a single dollar. But I told myself stories about why that was okay. He was younger. He was still figuring things out. He'd get there eventually. I was doing well enough that it didn't hurt me. I told myself a lot of things. This past March, Felix called me on a Thursday evening while I was making dinner. He sounded excited. That particular brand of excited that I'd learned to recognize over the years, the one that meant he wanted something. He told me he'd found his calling. He wanted to open a food truck. I asked him to tell me more. He did, for 45 minutes. He had a name picked out, a logo concept, a general idea of where he wanted to park it, a list of dishes he'd been experimenting with. It actually didn't sound terrible as ideas go. I told him that. I asked him about the business plan, the startup costs, the licensing and permits, the commercial kitchen requirements, the insurance. He said he was still working on that part. I told him those were the most important parts. He told me I was being negative. We ended the call on decent terms. I didn't think much more about it. 3 weeks later, he texted me. Hey, so I've been looking into everything, and I need $47,000 to get this off the ground the right way. I want to do this properly. Can you co-sign a business loan with me? You make good money and your credit is great. It wouldn't really cost you anything. I read it twice. I set my phone down and walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water and stood there drinking it slowly, looking out the window at the parking lot behind my apartment building. Then I picked up my phone and called him. Felix, I said, do you understand what co-signing a loan means? He said he did. Yeah, it just meant my name was on it too. I explained it more carefully. It meant I was equally responsible for the debt. It meant if he defaulted, for any reason at any point, my credit would take the hit. My financial standing, which I had spent 7 years building carefully and deliberately, would be on the line for $47,000. He said he wasn't going to default. He said he was serious about this. I asked him, how much he'd saved toward this. He said he had about $1,900 set aside. I asked him if he had any business experience. He said the food truck would be the experience. I told him I couldn't co-sign the loan. There was a long pause. Then he said, I thought you believed in me. I told him believing in him and co-signing a $47,000 loan were 2 completely different things. He said okay, he understood, and we hung up. He didn't sound angry. He sounded like someone filing something away for later. I didn't hear from him for 9 days. When he texted again, it was a long message. He'd been doing more research, he said. He'd found a smaller loan option, only $22,000. He'd also talked to our parents, and our mom thought this was a great opportunity for him, and she'd mentioned that I had a really strong financial position right now, and she thought maybe I could just loan him the money directly, out of my own savings, and he'd pay me back with interest once the business was profitable. I stared at that message for a long time. I called my mom. She answered on the second ring, cheerful, like we were about to talk about something normal. I asked her if she'd really suggested to Felix that I loan him $22,000 out of my personal savings. She said she hadn't said it exactly like that. She'd just mentioned that I was in a good place financially and that family helps family. I told her I had $31,000 in savings, that I had worked extremely hard for that money, that it represented my emergency fund, the start of a down payment on a home, and the beginning of a retirement cushion. Because I was 31 and trying to actually plan for my future. She said she knew that, honey, she wasn't saying give it all away, just some of it. I asked her what some meant. She said, well, Felix really needed about $22,000 to do this right, I said. So the full $22,000. She said, well, yes. I told her I wasn't going to do that. I told her I loved Felix, and I wanted good things for him, but I was not going to drain my savings account for a business that had no plan, no experience behind it, and a track record of. I stopped myself from listing every time Felix had borrowed money and never returned it. I took a breath. I said I was not in a position to do this. My mom was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, you know, your father and I have been talking, and we really think this could be Felix's moment. He's never had someone truly believe in him. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that we had all believed in Felix, repeatedly, at significant personal cost, and that believing in someone is not the same as writing them a check, I said. I'm not going to loan him the money, Mom, she said. I just hope you don't regret this, I said. I hope so too. We hung up. I sat down on my couch and looked at the ceiling for a while. I wasn't angry yet. I was something else. Tired, maybe, or hollowed out in a specific way that only certain family conversations can produce. The next morning I had a voicemail from my dad. My dad is a man of few words, generally. He works in construction management. He's practical to a fault. He doesn't usually get involved in these kinds of things. So when I saw the voicemail notification from him, I felt my stomach drop a little. I played it while I was getting dressed for work. He said he wasn't going to tell me what to do, but he said he'd talk to Felix, and Felix was really serious this time. He could hear it. And he said he knew I was busy and successful and he was proud of me. And then he said, I just think you have more than you need right now, and Felix has less than he needs. And family finds a way to even that out. I listened to it twice. Then I got in my car and drove to work. I thought about that phrase all day. Family finds a way to even that out. I turned it over in my mind while I sat in meetings and reviewed spreadsheets. I thought about what it implied. That my having saved money was somehow excess that belonged to the family pool. That building financial security was the same as hoarding resources that should be redistributed to whoever needed them most. That my 7 years of deliberate choices were not mine, but ours. I thought about the $400 car repair, the $800 course, the $2,200 for the phone bill and rent. I thought about how none of it had ever come back. I thought about how every conversation about Felix's next idea was always about potential and vision and belief, never about accountability or responsibilities. Or the last time, when I got home that evening, I had 3 texts from Felix, 2 from my mom and 1 from my aunt, my mom's younger sister, who I am close with, but who rarely gets involved in anything like this. My aunt's text said, Hey sweetheart, your mom mentioned what's going on with Felix. Just wanted to say I know this is hard, but he really does seem motivated this time, thinking of you. I appreciated that she wasn't demanding anything. But I understood what it meant. The circle was widening. The family was being briefed. I was being positioned. Felix's texts were a progression. The first one said he'd found a food truck for sale, slightly used, and the price had actually come down. So now he only needed $18,500. The second one said he'd talked to someone who'd run a food truck before and gotten some great advice. The third one said, I know you said no, but I really need you to reconsider. This is my shot. I've never asked you for anything this big. I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter and made pasta. That night, I called my best friend, Trisha, who I've known since college and who has watched the Felix situation evolve over the years from a front row seat. I told her what had happened. She listened. When I finished, she said, "How many times has he paid you back for anything?" I said, "0." She said, "And what would happen to you if you gave him $18,000 and the food truck failed?" I said, "I'd be starting over on my savings, basically. And I'd be on the hook for half the rent on a food truck parking space if he'd signed anything with my name involved." She said, "So what are you thinking?" I said, "I'm thinking about how I've been the responsible one my whole life and somehow that's turned into me being the family bank." She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Yeah, that's what happens. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up." The next morning was Saturday. I had planned to spend it at the farmer's market and then do some meal prep and maybe take a walk. Instead, I was sitting at my kitchen table at 8:47 a.m. with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, drafting a text to Felix in my head. My mom called before I could send anything. She asked if I'd thought more about it. I said I had. She asked what I'd decided. I said I hadn't changed my position. There was a pause. Then my mom said, "I really didn't want to say this, but your father and I have talked. And if you can't support your brother on something this important, we don't think we can cover your portion of the family vacation in July." I blinked. We had a trip planned to a rental house in the Outer Banks. Something my parents organized every couple of years, a long weekend with extended family, where my parents traditionally covered the base rental cost, and everyone splits extras. My share of the base cost was about $380. My mom had just told me that she was pulling $380 from me because I wouldn't give Felix $18,500. I said, "Okay." She seemed surprised by that. She said, "Okay?" "Yes, okay. That's your choice to make. I understand." She said, "I just think you need to understand that this affects more than just you and Felix." I said, "I understand that, Mom." She said, "I hope you'll think about what kind of sister you want to be." I said, "I have thought about it a lot, actually." We hung up. I sat there for a moment, and then, to my own mild surprise, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief, exactly, something quieter than that. Like a calculation that had been running in the background for years had finally completed. I picked up my phone and called Felix. He answered right away. I could hear the hopefulness in his voice. I said, "Hey, I want to have an honest conversation with you." He said, "Okay." I said, "I love you and I want you to succeed. I genuinely do. But I'm not going to co-sign a loan or loan you money for this. That's my final answer, and I don't want to go around it anymore." He said, "Why not? You can afford it." I said, "Having money doesn't mean I'm obligated to give it to you." He said, "I'm your brother." I said, "Yes, and I'm your sister. And at no point in my life did anyone sit me down and tell me that meant I was your financial backer." He got quiet. I said, "I've given you money before. I've never mentioned it, because I didn't want it to be a thing. But I've helped you out several times over the years, and none of it ever came back, and I want you to know that I'm aware of that." He said, "I was going to pay you back." I said, "Felix." He didn't say anything. I said, "If you want to open a food truck, there are paths to do that. There are small business grants, there are SBA microloans, there are incubator programs. The Denver Small Business Development Center has free consulting. These are real resources. I will help you research them. I will sit down with you and go through a business plan if you want. But I am not the source of funding for this." He said, "So you'll help me look stuff up, but you won't actually help me." I said, "That depends on what you mean by actually helping." He said, "I mean money." I said, "Then no." There was a long silence. Then he said, "I can't believe you." I said, "I'm sorry you feel that way." He hung up. I sat very still for a moment. My coffee was completely cold. Outside, the Denver morning was bright and almost aggressively cheerful. I texted my mom to let her know I'd spoken to Felix, that I'd given him my final answer, and that I genuinely hoped he would find a path forward. I didn't hear back from her for 3 hours. When she finally responded, she said, "Very disappointed in you. My dad sent nothing. My aunt sent a text that said, 'I heard. I'm sorry things got complicated. I love you.'" I went to the farmer's market. I bought tomatoes and a bunch of radishes and some locally made hot sauce, and I walked around in the sun for an hour and thought about almost nothing at all. It was the best hour I'd had in about 2 weeks. Over the following days, the family group chat, which is usually pretty quiet, got unusually active. My mom posted a few things, nothing directly about the situation, but with an energy that I recognized. My dad reacted to things without commenting. Felix went silent on the chat entirely. My cousin, my mom's brother's daughter, who I've always been friendly with, texted me privately. "Hey, I don't really know what's going on, but your mom seems upset about something with you and Felix. Are you okay?" I told her I was fine, that there had been a disagreement about money, and that I appreciated her checking in. She said, "That sounds exhausting. I'm sorry." Which was more than I needed, honestly. 2 weeks after the original text from Felix, I got a notification from my bank. I have a shared account with my parents. A holdover from when I was in college. Something I'd never gotten around to fully closing out because there was a small amount in it that we occasionally used for family expenses. It was linked to an autopay for something. I couldn't remember what. The account balance had dropped by $340. I called the bank. Turns out my mom had made a withdrawal. It was her account too, technically. She had every right to do it. It was $340. I didn't call her about it. I went online and removed my name from the account and transferred the remaining $60 to my primary checking account. It took about 15 minutes. Then I called the family vacation rental company and removed myself from the reservation. The deposit was non-refundable for my portion, $95. But I'd been told I was already being disinvited, so it didn't feel like much of a loss. And then I sat down and wrote Felix an email. I know that sounds formal, but I wanted something I could say carefully and clearly and that he couldn't interrupt. I told him I wasn't angry. I told him I understood that money is emotional and that asking for help is hard, and that being told no is harder. I told him I'd been thinking a lot about our relationship and about the dynamic that had developed over the years, and I wanted to be honest. I wasn't going to be the safety net anymore. Not because I didn't love him, but because I didn't think it was helping either of us. I told him I had spent years absorbing the consequences of his choices in small ways, and that I had let it go each time because I told myself it was easier. And because I didn't want conflict, and because somewhere along the way I had internalized the idea that being the stable one meant being the one who absorbed things, but I'd finally done the math. And the math didn't work. I told him I hoped he would pursue the food truck through legitimate channels. I told him I genuinely meant that. I told him if he ever wanted to talk, actually talk, not negotiate, I was here. I sent it at 10:48 on a Tuesday night. He read it. I could see the read receipt. He didn't respond. My mom called me the next morning. She said she'd heard I'd removed myself from the family vacation, and that she hoped I understood what that meant for the family. I said I did. She said, "It means you're choosing yourself over your family." I said, "I think I'm choosing to stop letting the family make financial decisions on my behalf." She said I was being dramatic. I said I hoped she had a wonderful time at the Outer Banks. That conversation lasted 4 minutes. Here's the thing about being the responsible one that nobody talks about. It's not really a personality trait. It's a role that gets assigned, and once it's assigned, it calculates into everyone else's planning. People stop asking if you're okay and start asking if you can handle things. People stop worrying about your stability and start relying on it. And, along the way, your stability stops being yours and starts being a resource that belongs to the household, to the family, to whoever needs it most. I'd been doing a slow accounting of this for a while. The Felix situation just finally made it impossible to ignore. About a month after all of this, 4.5 weeks after I'd sent the email, Felix never answered. I got a call from a former colleague who had moved to a firm in Seattle. She said they were looking for a senior analyst, the kind of role that would be a meaningful step up for me, and she thought of me immediately. I asked her to send me the job description. I read it 3 times. I called her back and said I was interested. What followed was 6 weeks of interviews, case studies, reference checks, and the particular anxious excitement of wanting something badly enough that you try not to want it too, obviously. I told almost no one. Trisha knew. My therapist knew. My manager, eventually, because I needed to be honest with her if it progressed. The offer came on a Wednesday afternoon. It was a real offer. Senior title, significant salary increase, full relocation package, a team that sounded genuinely collaborative. Seattle. A city I'd visited once and liked more than I expected. I accepted it the following Monday. I gave notice at my job. I started making lists. I called my landlord about my lease. I began the long, satisfying process of deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. I told my parents 2 weeks after I accepted, not because I was hiding it, but because I needed that 2 weeks to be mine, quiet and clean and uncontaminated by anyone else's reaction. My mom's first response was, "What about Felix?" I said, "What about him?" She said, "He's been going through a hard time." "You're just leaving?" I said, "I'm taking a job. In Seattle." "That has nothing to do with Felix," she said. "It's very far," I said. "It's a 4-hour flight." She said, "I just don't understand why you couldn't have found something here." I said, "Because the opportunity is there." My dad, to his credit, said, "Is it a good opportunity?" I said it was. He said, "Good for you." And that was the most he said about it, but it was enough. Felix texted me 2 days later. It was the first contact since the read receipt on my email. "Mom told me about Seattle. Congrats, I guess, must be nice." I stared at that for a while. I wrote back, "Thank you. I hope things are going well for you." He didn't respond to that either. My last day in Denver was a Saturday in late fall. I'd sold most of my furniture. My car was being shipped. I had 2 suitcases and a carry-on, and a very clear mental picture of what my new apartment looked like, from the dozen times I'd pulled up the listing photos on my phone. The family vacation had happened in July without me. My mom had sent a single photo to the group chat, the house, the beach. Everyone gathered on the deck. I'd liked it and said it looked beautiful. She'd responded with a heart emoji. Felix had, I'd heard from my cousin, not launched the food truck. He was working at a sporting goods store and, according to my cousin, who meant well but had limited editorial restraint, really getting his life together. I hoped that was true. I genuinely did. My aunt drove me to the airport. We stood outside the departures terminal in the gray Denver morning, and she hugged me for a long time. And she said, "I'm proud of you, No," I said. "For leaving?" she said, "for knowing when to." I thought about that the whole flight to Seattle. When I landed, I turned my phone back on. There was a text from my mom, "Safe travels," sent 2 hours earlier, while I was in the air. There was one from Trisha that was just a string of celebration emojis. There was nothing from Felix and nothing from my dad, and that was fine. All of it was fine. I picked up my bags. I walked out into the Seattle afternoon, which was overcast and cool, and smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet. I found my rideshare. I got in the car. The driver asked where I was headed. I gave him the address of my new apartment. He typed it in and pulled away from the curb, and I watched the airport disappear behind us, and I thought about how I had spent years being the person everyone else's plans accounted for. The stable variable, the fallback, the one who would handle it. And how quietly, without drama or announcement, I had simply stopped. Not out of anger, not even out of principle, exactly. Just because I'd finally done the math, and the math said, "This is my life, and I'm the only one who gets to decide what it's worth."